In today's episode, we're talking about digital marketing, building a personal brand, and how a personal brand can help elevate the organization that you're associated with. From EngageMint, I'm David Millay, and this is Flip the Switch. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Flip the Switch, where we sit down with leaders in customer experience and employee experience, and we try to figure out what are the trends that they're paying attention to? What are the experiments that they're running? What are the practices that have guided their careers to success? Then we take all those insights and we apply them to the world of sports and entertainment, hospitality, service, your organization. Now, today's guest, we are sitting down with Preston McClellan. Preston is the co-founder and managing partner of a company called the Golf Space Collective. They're really the first digital marketing agency specifically catered to the golf industry. They're doing everything from digital marketing, branding and creative, research and analysis, strategic partnerships, marketing tech, email marketing, event management, social media management, CRM deployment, website design. You get the picture. Really, it is all things digital. Now, when we think about Preston and the value that he's going to add to you, Preston's background really is an interesting fit for this. He spent the last 7 years before co-founding Golf Space Collective with the PGA Tour. He was the director of player content. So when we think about that, is that he wasn't running the PGA Tour's brand, but he was helping all the players on the PGA Tour develop their own personal brand and try to create more fans of themselves, which then would lift up the larger PGA Tour's brand. And we're going to talk about that dynamic, about how a individual human's brand can lift their brand that they work with or work for. But this episode is going to be really relevant for you if you are trying to create your own personal brand, trying to decide what platforms to be on, what to post, what not to post, whether you are an athlete or you have athletes that are trying to do that, or if you're just an administrator working for one of these organizations and you want to build your personal brand out, this episode is going to be relevant for you. If you want to get in touch with him after you hear the episode and you hear the value that he can bring, we're going to put links to get in touch with him in the show notes. So without further ado, let's jump into this episode with my friend, Preston McClellan. Preston, what's happening? Welcome to the show.
How you doing, man? Thanks for having me. Excited to talk some sports, golf, digital, all of the above.
I'm excited to jump in. I know we're going to cover a lot of great topics, but let's start with the first one. I've been getting more into actually trying to distribute clips from this podcast and getting more into social, but you are a social media OG. Your Instagram handle is simply @Preston. Like you had to be one of the first users to get that. So what initially drew you to the space and what inspired you to make a career out of it?
Yeah, for sure. It's like I go back and forth whether thinking that's cool or it just makes me sound old at this point. But yeah, I've been on Instagram. Cool. I think I actually joined it for a class, and that's part of the story of why I got into social media. So I was in undergrad from 2008 to 2012. I'd always wanted to do some sort of writing in sports specifically. So I was in journalism at the University of Memphis, and I happened to have a professor who was really early into social media. And we had this class where part of one of the assignments was we had to every day of the semester, we had to take a picture, post it, and write a caption for it. And the platform she chose for us to use at the time was this new thing called Instagram, which was literally, it just like she happened to have discovered it not too long after it launched in the App Store. I think it was in 2010 was when it launched.
Wow.
And so we just it was still like the old blue logo, pre-Facebook acquisition. You only could take photos from your camera. It had those archaic looking filters now. But the premise of it was to get used to creating daily content. And so like looking back at it, that was 13 years ago now. And it's wild how far ahead of that she was. And her name's Dr. Carrie Brown. She's the head of journalism department at CUNY now up in New York City. And she really is I credit her to that's why I got into social media for the class. And then I just started started realizing there's a lot of power in it. And I was working in the athletic department at Memphis. I went to Memphis to play golf originally. That I was not as good as I thought I was. So I ended up just working in the athletic department and working for the golf teams. And so after I'd gotten onto the platforms, I kind of went to the coaches hey, I started doing this in my class. I think it would be cool. Literally no business thinking. It was I think it'd be cool if I took pictures of the stuff that I was doing. So I just started doing that. And we created a Memphis men's golf Twitter and Instagram account. And we started getting some followers, and then other coaches in the athletic department were like, hey, what's this? And then so suddenly by my junior year, stuff had started to become real in 2011 a little bit. Like Facebook had launched brand
Mhm.
pages. There was a little bit more push into people understanding social, and they just tasked me as like the 20-year-old in the office, like, hey, you understand this stuff? Can you work with the athletic department to start everything? So I ended up starting like the original Memphis Tigers Twitter account, Facebook
No
account, Instagram
way.
account, all that stuff. Yeah, it was wild. Like back in the, I didn't even think anything of it back then, right? It was just like my job. Like, oh, it's a new thing. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. Like this thing could go away in 2 years, but it was a good way to connect with fans. And so we started doing that. And then by the end of my college career, I knew it was going to be a thing, but it was still really early, like 2012. And actually, so I went to grad school at OU, Ohio University, thinking that I was like couldn't make that into a career. Basically, like in
Yeah.
2012, I was like, "There's no jobs really. Like I need to go get a
Mhm.
business degree and understand things more." And it's really at OU where I crystallized that, okay, no, this is going to be a thing. I'm just going to go all the way into this. Like I've realized that I was really early to it, and none of my classmates that I was talking to had any concept of it. And then the real thing was when I would connect with alumni that I was like interested in their jobs, they would
Mhm.
ask me about what I was interested in, and I would talk about it, and they all would be like, "Oh, we need someone to do that. I have no idea how to do that." And I was like, "Well, I can do that, you know." And so anyway, there's a little bit of a long story, but I kind of stumbled into
Yeah.
it for a class, really liked it, and it turned into a career.
I wonder if our boy Laird Veach over at Memphis, he's been on the podcast. Like, actually, so he came
Yeah,
on, I think, during COVID, and he just had so much transition happening at one
I
time, so
bet.
much
Yeah,
chaos. But I wonder
yeah.
if he knows that you started that. I highly
I don't
doubt that.
know. Yeah, no, I
We'll,
think he came
we'll have
in
to
way
tag
after
him in this.
me. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Way
I know
after
the
you.
name though. I know the name because both well, my mom still works at the University of Memphis, so I'm still like connected there and everything. So always be a Tiger for sure.
Too funny. Well, something that you said that I want to key in on, you said, at the time you were the 20-year-old, the young kid. And so naturally they just gave this to you. But
Yep.
obviously, where we are today, it is a much more sophisticated space. It's integral to every business. And I think you getting your MBA helped you understand the business value of it.
Mhm.
And that's kind of led you into your career where it does take a lot more analytical thinking if you're going to do it well. It's not just let's give it to the young kid. So maybe let's
Yeah.
talk about your time that you spent with the PGA Tour, where you really were analytical in terms of how you approach social in helping individual athletes build their brands through social. So, like, what are, I
Yep.
guess, yeah, maybe talk a little bit about that role. And then I want to get into some of the frameworks or techniques that you actually use to help an athlete identify their personal brand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the tour was it was such a dream job, honestly. It was like one of those things. I was working in Chicago at a sports marketing agency called Navigate Research, which, by the way, there's one
Oh,
of my
yeah.
friends from the tour named Ron Lee. Guys should definitely have him on this podcast. But, and I was just, I knew that was a temporary thing. I literally saw its job on this Teamwork Online for the PGA Tour. It was called Digital Communications Manager. And I was like, hey, digital communications, that's literally like, that's me. And I applied to it literally off a job board. I emailed a couple people that I knew and so I got the job. But when I got there, they were like, hey, so your job is to go out for this entire first year and meet with as many of our players, our athletes and agents as you can and convince them to join social media platforms. Because basically at the time, and this was in February of 2015 when I first got hired, and the tour had data, they had done some like outside consulting work, and they realized how woefully behind their athletes were from a following basis
Yeah.
compared to even like NASCAR and the NHL. Like the PGA Tour will never be like the NFL or NBA, but they were
Sure.
behind in areas where they should be. So they brought me on specifically to be basically a liaison between the existing small content team and the athletes, and to consult with them and like ask them like, hey, do you know what Twitter is? Do you know what Instagram is? Have you thought about joining it? Here's why you should, and here's where we think this is going. Here's how we can support you on these platforms, things of that nature. So the interesting thing was is like all my experience creating the content, when I was 20
Mhm.
really made that conversation super easy because that's the first question someone asks is, well, what am I going to post? Right. And so it's like,
100%.
that's an easy question for me to ask. So yeah, it kind of led into that. And then that role evolved
Can,
significantly over the 7 years I spent there.
can I pause you real quick?
Yeah. Mhm.
What was in it for the PGA to go to the players and say get on board? Because like
Yep.
whether Rory's on Twitter or not doesn't directly help them financially, right? So what was the and I think
Nope, it doesn't. Yeah.
a lot of athletic departments right now in the NIL and the college space are going through this process right now. Where I
Yep.
think
Yeah. Yeah.
in my mind a lot of them are underutilizing their own athletes and
Yep.
underinvesting in helping them create their own personal brands because they don't
100%.
think
I
they don't
agree.
see the direct compensation. So maybe talk to us a little
Yeah.
bit about the PGA's thinking there.
Yeah, so kind of there's two parts to this answer. One is the more broader answer, and one specific to the tour's business model. But the broader answer that would apply to like NIL and colleges is I would literally always use this metaphor. I probably said it 5 million times in my life. Is that a rising tide lifts all ships? So that if more players are following athletes that are a part of your brand, more people are following your brand inherently, right?
Mm.
So that was kind of like that was my boss that hired the first boss of the tour that hired me. His name was Ken Lovell. This was all his idea to hire this job, and he was so right in the approach to do it. It was basically like, look, at the end of the day, human beings want to connect with human beings, right? Like, we all know that if LeBron posts one piece of content and the Lakers post the exact same piece of content, LeBron's going to get more engagement every time. But even if the least
Always.
followed player on the Lakers posted the same highlight, it would probably still get more engagement than the team account because it's a human being. People want
Mhm.
to connect with people in real life, and it's the same on social media. And so that was kind of the tour's broad understanding, is like, hey, if we take the collective following of all of our athletes from 20 million to 60 million, which is what we did in 5 years, then there's a lot more eyeballs on the PGA Tour because
Yeah,
they're PGA Tour athletes. Like, you think of Rory McIlroy, you think of the PGA, right? Or PGA Tour,
no
right? It's
question.
like, and it's a kind of inherent connection. And so they realize that. And so that's the macro one. The unique one to the tour, and this is public knowledge, so I'm not sharing any trade secrets, but the tour is actually a nonprofit organization. It's one of the last remaining big entities in sports. It's a 501(c)(3) pass-through organization. So
Interesting.
the tour actually counts player revenues as part of their business, essentially. So it is in the mission statement for the mission statement for the PGA Tour, boiled down to one sentence, is to increase financial opportunities for the members being the athletes. So the athletes are actually the owners of the PGA Tour. It's a membership organization. They're not under contract, they're independent contractors. So the tour is highly incentivized to help the athletes make as much money off the course as they do on the course. So part of our pitch to them, and the tour now has an entire department called Player Partnerships that does the business side of this, is to help them increase their exposure online and then go out and monetize it, because that will help both them and the tour.
I had no idea that was how it was
Yeah,
structured.
yeah,
I again, my brain always, we spend a lot of time with college athletics departments, helping them increase customer experience, employee experience, and
yeah,
revenue generation and fandom. And part of me, I hear that model and I'm like, is that a model that they go to eventually? Because you're not going to make those
right,
kids
yeah,
employees, right? The taxes that they're going to
correct,
be paying
yeah,
on stuff alone is going
yeah.
to be dumb. But maybe that's a model you go to. I don't know. Anyway, it's
Yeah,
maybe a
it's a
conversation for a
pass.
different
It's
time.
I think the accounting term is a pass through organization, basically, to where like every dollar that the tour takes in goes out somewhere, and that includes like purse size that the players play for, employee costs, running like the TBC courses that they own, but a large part of it is player earnings and player compensation.
Fascinating. Well, let's get back to the original
Yeah,
question. So you said your role evolved over time at the
yeah,
PGA, where you
yeah,
weren't just going out and asking guys, "Are you on Twitter? How can I help you get on Twitter?" That kind of thing. So talk to us about
yeah.
how that role evolved and where you started to go with helping guys establish their frameworks for how to grow their brand.
Yep, for sure. It was, the first year was really just a lot of me introducing myself and getting the guys comfortable with who I was, and knowing that I was a golfer.
Mhm.
I'm not some kid that's never played the game before that's coming up to them and telling them this. And so there was a few players that I had actually played junior golf with, and that gave me some instant credibility, which was nice. But it was so after that initial thing, in 2016, really what kind of like kicked off the stuff is I actually met Blake Lawrence, the CEO of
Mhm.
Open Doors, at the Twitter Sports Conference in early 2016, and Open Doors was like a year into like pivoting their product, because it's funny. Open Doors started as an NIL product. They then pivoted to be an advocacy product when pre NIL, and now they're doing both. But at the time, they were like really looking for a big name brand to come in and just leverage their software to get content to athletes. And that was the biggest problem I was having to the players, because the players in the tour have all the rights to post highlights, photos of themselves at the events, but we had no mass mechanism to get that to them. So like, I was texting it to them, or like the idea that they're going to understand how to use a Dropbox link is they're not. Like, I
Yeah.
actually had a really funny story. There's a player that I texted a Dropbox link to in late 2015, and he just tweeted the link to the Dropbox
Oh
instead of
no.
like that. He didn't like understand the concept of downloading the video. And that was kind of an aha moment of like, all right, I got to figure that out. So I talked to Blake. We launched that in mid 2016, and that's really what kicked it off, is us being able to provide content to the athletes and prove to them this is really not hard. And that was the pitch I would always make to the athletes is like, look, you guys have it easier than any other type of creator in the universe because people just want to see what you're already doing. They just want to be a fly on the wall in whatever it is that you're doing, right? So like if you're hitting range balls, if you're putting, if you're chipping, if you're practicing, if you're in your locker, just literally like you don't even have to do it. Give it to the phone to your caddy, give it to your agent. Like literally it's the easiest thing in the world. And then we supplement that with 1 or 2 posts a week of stuff that a highlight of you making a putt or, a dramatic, great photo of you in a practice round and stuff like that. And so we had a couple of early, like Rory actually was he joined it like really early on Open Doors. And we had some really early success of me funneling like highlights of Rory in 2016 to his Facebook and Twitter at the time. Instagram was still a little difficult to post video, which is hilarious to think about now. But so we had that quick wins. And then with Rory, like we were able to go to other players and be like, hey, look, the top player on the tour is leveraging this. He's getting business out of it. And that's really what led to like the team expanding. So I went from just me. And then by the time I left the tour, there was 7 people working on what we call the player content team. And it's still a fully functioning team at the tour now. It's like probably with what I'll always be most proud of because I really think that will probably exist in perpetuity to some degree at the tour. And it's like I fully created that on my own, which is pretty cool.
That's so cool. I think I think it's massive in a lot of different spaces because I think the core principle there of humans relate to other humans much more than they relate to brands is so prevalent right now. And a lot of these older established sports brands, whether it's college sports, pro sports, national governing bodies, whatever it might be, some realize that better than others. But it still amazes me how much more resources get dedicated towards growing the brand than growing the individuals in the brand. But that's just not the trend right now.
Totally in sports and otherwise too. I see it's like, we've connected on like personal LinkedIn content and stuff like that. Like if you were doing a startup today, like you should grow your personal brand, not the startup brand, right? At first, because it's going to be far easier for me to connect with a CEO of the brand than the brand itself. And then you can like parlay that in later down on the line into the brand. But yeah, I think, traditional, like there's so much changes occurring in digital, right? And like, I think it's just wild that like, there's a lot of people that are in executive positions, especially in sports, that did not grow up with this stuff. And they know it's important, but they don't really know the mechanisms of how and why and all of these things. And it's like, I think that leads to some unfortunate KPIs a lot of times of like, they just want to see things going up and to the right on a graph and they want to see green instead of red. And they're not necessarily understanding that it's like, okay, this is a lot more qualitative now. This is a lot more of an audience building mechanism or community management side of things. And like, we might reach only 500 people, but if they're the right 500 people, it's way more valuable than 1,000, and I think communicating 100%. That is still a challenge, but it's getting easier and easier, I think, which is nice.
Yeah. And that's where you get into the business models of it. And how are you selling your, anyway, we could go, we could go off. On even behind the scenes on this podcast, right? Like we don't have like the craziest numbers from downloads, but I know who's downloading and listening to the episodes because we're having conversation and they're potential clients for our consulting and training business that we do. And I'm like, if one person that's listening buys a training or a workshop with us, the podcast is paid for itself for the year, and that's where that's
how I view like all of my personal content too. Like the time I spend writing for my Twitter and my LinkedIn, it's like, it's my cold calling is what I tell people is like the idea, like, I've been lucky enough to, meet a lot of people in sports. So my natural network is just very large, but it's unrealistic that I would actually actively connect with all of those people on a regular basis. But social media gives us this opportunity to pop up in people's feeds. And you never know when popping up meets a need that someone has. And they're like, oh, I should call him. And like, that's what's happened to our business here is like, we've done, I started my own consulting in January of last year and started Golf Space in September of last year. And I've still never done any sort of cold business development. It's literally all been inbound or referrals of people. And a lot of it, I've literally had 4+ clients that just say, hey, like saw your post on LinkedIn and reminded me that you started your own business. I actually have a project. I'd love to talk to you. And it's like, that's perfect. Like, however many hours I spend a week, it's fully worth it.
That's where too this what we're talking about here and what we're going to be talking about for the next 30 minutes is not just relevant to athletes. I think it's super relevant to anybody that is on the sales side of things. Like if you're in
Yeah, absolutely.
development or fundraising or corporate partnerships, like you should be posting stuff about your personal life. Like I look at your content that you're sharing. It's not just about the business. You're posting motivational
Yeah,
stuff from workouts in the morning at 5 a.m., but it gives personality and tells me who Preston is. And if I'm going to do
yep,
business with you, I kind of want to know all those different things. And like it makes me
100%.
respect you more that you're in the gym at 5 a.m. And it's going to help me on. It might help you with the next sale. And so
Yeah,
if you're in any type of sales in sports, in the sports world or outside of that, right? Like be posting
yep.
this. Take these same lessons that we're talking about
100%.
from a personal
People are
brand
going to
and apply
Google
it.
you. Like, if you don't think that the first thing that someone does when they meet you now is search for you on the internet, then you're completely naive, right? People are, I guess, I heard someone say this on a podcast recently that we don't have the benefits of first impressions anymore because everyone already has an impression of you before they ever meet you. And I thought that was like really profound because unless you have no digital footprint whatsoever, which is very, very rare, before I meet or talk to you, I'm going to know things about you, right? And I don't have context necessarily of them, but I'm whatever's out there publicly, I'm going to form a perception of you,
Yeah.
and that's like you have to be cognizant of that. And I think I tell that to like that's one of the first thing I told my students in my class that I'm teaching this semester, even though it's completely unrelated, is like, hey, a lot of you are about to graduate. Please do an audit of your online presence because it will come back to either bite you or really help you if you do
Yeah.
it right. So yeah, the lack of a first impressions thing was I thought was a really cool way to frame that and think about it.
I love it. So, okay. So listeners listening to this, they get it. They get the principles. They want to get started on this. They want to start having a more intentional personal brand. I'm going to ask a lot of selfish questions here as well. But
Yeah, you're fine.
what are some of like the frameworks that you would use when you were helping athletes build out that personal brand? Like
Yeah.
what are the initial questions? What are the frameworks? Do you have like set methodology that you would come in and you'd be like, hey, you need to build a, I don't know. I'm going to ask that. I'm going to leave it
Yeah.
open ended there, but like, how would you approach that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a great question. We ended up designing a whole program at the tour. We called it Catalyst. I mean, it was just an internal name, but it was just basically as a catalyst to your personal brand. And it started when you first got your PGA Tour card. So every player when they first receive a tour card has to go through like a mandatory orientation, which I thought was hilarious. Like I literally had like I sat in a conference room with John Rahm like 6 years ago when he was a rookie, like him taking notes on a piece of paper, and it's just hilarious to think about now. But part of that process was a fact finding for the tour as well, both from a potential partnership standpoint and a content standpoint. So we designed this program called Catalyst, and there was literally a data-based questionnaire that we developed from everything from where you're from, what's your favorite sport, what teams do you root for, what brands do you wear, what types of food do you eat, all of these things. It was about 30 to 50 questions depending on the year. And then we'd meet the players and talk to them and like just get to know them on a qualitative basis. And then we would literally put together like a creative brief for them on like what we think based on what we know of you now, your interests, and the audiences that exist on social. These are some like running lanes basically,
Mm,
and so for a lot of the golfers in particular, they were coming to starting with nothing, right? So like that's a whole nother conversation too. Is golf is really unique compared to other sports because the athletes are way more introverted than other sports
mm,
because it's an individual sport. So if you think about if I'm a professional golfer to get to that point, I've spent a crazy amount of time by myself to get good, and
interesting.
I've only been on maximum amount of time I've ever been on a team is 8 years in high school and college. Otherwise, it's always been by myself. So you get a lot of people that get to the professional level that are just totally introverted and have no interest in doing what we're talking about here. So part of
Mm,
it is convincing them that there's value in it and that whether or not they want it, they're famous now. Like literally that was like I had a slide on my presentation in the orientation that was like, congratulations, you're famous now. And because inevitably, like, people in the room would just think, we're all humans. We just think we're ourselves until we're not, until people like, I had to remind them that they're now going to have a verified, social media presence. They're now, when people Google them, things will come up about them.
yep.
And
Yep.
I just basically would talk to them about like, I would suggest that you own that presence. But in terms of building the brand, we'd start with the questionnaire. We'd run literally like analysis and like, it would spit out some data points of like, this person likes these three teams, and in the PGA Tour library, we have all this content that we can match up and stuff like that. So there's some technology built in there as well, but a lot of it is qualitative, just getting to know a person, and then based on my years of experience in the platforms of suggesting like, okay, this person probably would do a little bit better on Twitter because they really love sports of other sports, and they could like lean into live commentary while watching the Georgia Bulldogs and kind of create a brand around that. Or if this person's really private, I probably would push them towards Instagram because they can just post a couple of photos a week and still build an audience without having to actually engage too much. So like a good example there is Adam Scott is a pretty well known golfer. He is one of the most private human beings you'll ever meet. Like, I don't think a picture of his children exists on the internet, and he's been like super intentional about that. But he had a sponsor deal in like 2018 or 19 with Uniqlo, and part of the deal was him starting an Instagram account. So we worked with him, and the entire strategy was just 2 to 3 golf pictures and highlights a week. And he hired a community manager to like respond to people's comments and stuff like that. But he was pretty upfront with the audience and saying, I'm not posting, but you're going to get content here you would never get anywhere else. So there's still like value in it. So I guess it's a bit of a winding answer to say like you just have to get to know the person and then use your own expertise to kind of put together a plan for them.
If I was building something myself, or let's say, again, either I'm a college athlete starting off into this and I don't have the kind of resources or the technology, or I'm a professional and I'm trying to build my personal brand, like what are some of those questions that you might ask? Like thinking about, how do I determine what platform fits best? Should I be focused on quality or quantity? Those type of things. What is there?
Yeah.
Any good resources that you have that are like available?
Yeah. Well, first thing I would say is like, before I get into specifics, is people spend way too much time asking themselves those questions rather than just starting and figuring it out. So I'm a huge believer of like, if you think you want to do something online, just start doing it because you're going to suck at it regardless of when you start, more than likely. So like, if you think you want to start writing on Twitter, start writing on Twitter. Like it may be terrible for a little while and you can start learning and apply some of the resources we'll talk about in a minute. But like you should go ahead and start because every day or week or month that you don't start, you're just putting yourself further behind. Because like if people haven't realized it yet, like we're heading into like a wildly new part of like economy of the creator economy, right? Like the most powerful people in the next 10 years are going to be people that have an audience online. And there's going to be more and more people that realize that over the next 1, 2, 3 years, and there's going to be more and more competition in this space. So the earlier you start now, the better.
Yep.
So that's my soapbox for action. But in terms of like specific tools and questions to ask yourself, like I literally start like when I'm working with a new, like for example, a new brand or client or whatever, we just get on a call and I literally ask them to do what you did to start it here is like, tell me your origin story. So that's what I would tell people to do yourself is if you've never written down your story in any capacity, you should do that. You should go through the exercise of, it could be a narrative, it could be bullet points, it could be you saying it out loud as in a recording, but you should rehearse your story. And I guarantee you, if you go through from your childhood to whatever the pivotal moment was, you will just naturally start to think, oh, that could be a piece of content. Okay, that could be, so that's the first exercise is just like telling your own story to yourself and understanding that. And the second one is, I think if you've never written before, you almost have to invest into some sort of class or content writing system because it's very difficult to create it on your own. So like the OG LinkedIn influencer, Justin Welsh, I actually took his like LinkedIn, I bought that class, wildly helpful, even for me who have been in this stuff for a decade, because he just had a couple of very specific Excel documents of like how to frame things. And that's been a game changer for me. So I guess that would be the number one thing I would say to people is like, go find someone that's already successful doing what you're doing, reach out to them, engage with them, and see if they'll mentor you, first of all. And if not, they probably have resources available for you to help you learn from something they're already doing.
I love that. Great things. I think if you are in the NIL space specifically, now we're going in the athlete side, the first money that you make from any kind of deals from growing this type of stuff should go back into investing to grow that skill set, like a Justin Welsh course or something like that. And we can link to that in the show notes. So you've got that. I think that's great for any professional as well in terms of how to grow. Justin Welsh is like tried and true. Awesome. And that course I've heard great things about.
It's
cool.
really good. And go ahead.
The next thing I kind of wanted to ask around this is like, are there different strategies for deepening connections with current followers versus attracting new followers to an athlete or a brand social, right? Because I think there is a specific difference. Like we always say for us, like we're really good at helping brands deepen connections. There are people that
Mhm.
are better than me and my team at creating new fans, but we're going to get
Yeah.
you more money from and create deeper emotional
Yep.
connections with the people that are already attracted to your brands. That's our strength. So I think that is a difference
Mhm.
in terms of social or digital engagement. How do you connect deeper versus how do you bring new fans? So what do you feel like you place more of an importance on, and what are some of those strategies?
Yeah. I think it would probably depend on where the brand or the company or whatever you're working with is in their life cycle of like what's more important, right? So like for example, we just started working with this company called Putter, Puttr. If you guys are golfers, you'll love it. It's like an in-house putting mat with technology built in, but they're
Mhm.
brand new, right? It was a Kickstarter campaign. They got funded. They now have units in market, and now they have investors. And they started from absolute zero, right? So in that scenario, it's 100% focused on scaling as fast as possible and getting an audience at all to begin with, right? But then to your point, once you get to a little bit of a benchmark, you have to start doing both, and that's where the kind of the art and the science comes in, and a mix of organic, paid, and then also driving them to other platforms. Because I think you would probably agree with me on this, that social is a huge component of your sales process, but it's usually the front end of the sales process, right? Like you're trying to drive that customer somewhere else to get them to do something at some point, right? And so I think that's really what we work with a lot of our brands with, is like, what does that funnel look like, and how are we going to go from organic interest to, you know, to awareness, to purchase, to advocacy, this traditional marketing stuff. And a lot of what we do with that is like, I mean, big believers in just classic old email marketing because it's one of the most data heavy sides of things. So we really try to get people to, like, once they're a social follower, I wouldn't say we're necessarily doing anything super different with them other than like responding, engaging with their content, building a community. But we're trying to get them to plug in on other places that are of higher revenue value to the client, right? So like the Texas Golf Association would be a good example. Is we're trying to get people to follow Instagram, but eventually we want them to sign up for any number of the clubs that we have within TGA. And so we're trying to do that. And it's like, so there's
Interesting.
different tactics, I guess, depending on where the person is
Yep.
in their journey. But last thing I'll say is on the audience building and community. Like, I think a lot of brands shockingly just don't have a community manager. Like they just literally don't reply to people or give them
Yep.
any sort of, two-way conversation. And I think a lot of brands think they need to be like Wendy's or something and like have this like crazy funny voice or whatever. And like, you don't have to do that at all. You could just literally be super straightforward, but make people feel like you're listening. Because like, if I'm a customer or a fan of your brand, and especially if you're a relatively small brand,
Mhm.
and I comment on a post and I don't get a reply, that's a turnoff. I mean, because it's like,
No doubt.
I know someone saw this. Like, how, like, come on, like take 2 seconds, like, to reply to me. And so that's just a small tactical thing that I notice all the time. That's something we change with our clients quite often.
We talk about this all the time, which is like the difference between an audience and a community. And I think a lot of
Hmm.
traditional sports brands who have naturally had this big audience because
Yeah.
they're on TV all the time, and like you grow up and you're passionate about it, and so you naturally follow them. But there's a large difference between an audience and a community, and in order to turn it more into a community, you do have to have that two-way dialogue where you're going
Yep.
back and forth and you're encouraging relationships amongst followers, not just a one-to-many approach. And
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
does take a specific skill set. Like to your point around Adam Scott hiring a community manager, there is a
Yep.
specific skill set to there. Not just anyone can do that. You don't just throw
Yeah.
your
Oh,
intern
totally.
on it.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah,
but
the
anyway,
group,
I think
the something you just said is like perfect. Actually, it's like getting your fans to be friends and like talk about you or your brand independent of you is like the ultimate goal, right? Because then
no
then
doubt.
they're the advocates, right? So it's like we've actually found like Facebook groups have had a huge comeback. I think in the last year. I don't know how much of that you guys have done, but like my aside from my business, my wife is an online fitness trainer, and we work with other trainers to like help their business quite a bit. And that's the number one thing we've seen success with in the last year, is putting clients of teams into coaching groups and just letting them get to know each other, because then they become super fans of the coach, and they're all like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
I'm team Kiki or whatever. And sports brands could absolutely do the same thing. It's like message boards of 2023.
there's those things still exist out there. And like, I am
Yeah,
always shocked when we talk to teams about that. When we're talking about voice of the fan stuff, we might be trying to help them
right.
start up a survey or get more data. But the question that we always ask is like, how are you guys, who's on the message boards? Like, who's engaging with fans on the message boards? And it's like, they're always just complaining about the coach. So we don't go into those message boards. And I'm like, you're
Yeah.
missing a massive opportunity to facilitate and control that
Hmm.
dialogue. And you're just
Yep.
letting it
And
happen
those are
out
your
there
biggest
without that.
fans.
No doubt.
Those are your hardcore fans, right? Like if they're willing to spend time complaining, they care. And I think that's like something that a lot of sports bring. I mean, I had this at the tour as well. It's like, like the tour is an interesting battle between the golden goose demographic of the older people that kind of pay the bills, and then the tour needing to go after the younger people, right? And there's always a little bit of
Mm.
a clash around that. And it's like, yeah, I super relate to that side of things.
Can we go deeper into that, because I think a lot
Mhm.
of traditional sports are facing that right now. Like, we've had Rachel Jacobson on from Drone Racing League, and like the way that
Mhm.
they're approaching business is totally different than like your typical stick and ball sports. But to your point
Yep.
around PGA maybe more so than anybody has faced this, like, we've got an older fan base and we
Yep.
need to get younger. And so
Yep.
from a strategy standpoint, I think a lot of the work that you've done is part of that mission to get younger.
Yeah,
So,
100%. Yeah.
so what
Yeah.
advice would you give to some of these older, more traditional brands whose fan base is older, but they're trying to get younger?
Yeah. The number one thing is to lean into the athletes, right? Especially if you're a college brand, because you're going to have a constant rotating shift of kids that are coming through the brand. And I think it ties back to the same conversation. It's just empowering people that have a representation of your brand that can actually connect with those different audience types. So that was the main reason my boss hired me at the tour and created that job, was because he at the time realized, hey, our athletes that are on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at the time, the audiences of those athletes are wildly younger than our traditional audience here at the tour. So there's an easy way to get out in front of them. And then the unique thing about golf too, that is something that I learned while I was there, and they have a lot of data to support it, is that there actually is data to support that people age into the golf audience. So the tour has actually gotten a little more confident recently around the fact that there's basically a life cycle of a golf fan. So like a hardcore golf fan, typically they would be exactly like what I am. You would start playing sometime as a child, like in your kid years, and you probably play quite a bit. You take a long break during college and in your 20s when you're concerned with other things and maybe don't have a lot of expendable income. You start playing quite a bit again in your early 30s, and then you start getting obsessed with it when you have a lot of expense. So the tour almost has this aging. So like they're more comfortable with knowing, okay, 55 to 65 is our core market because they've been playing golf their whole. But what the tour has figured out is they have to facilitate the development of those people at all the life cycles of that. And so that's why you'll see their partnerships with Top Golf, for example, partnerships with the First Tee, for example, stuff like that, because they know that the biggest indicator of if someone's going to watch the PGA Tour is if they play golf. There's a ton of data to show that. And so they just need to get people playing because they know that they'll ultimately age into watching professional golf. And then there's also a lot of data that shows the amount of people that watch pro golf and the amount of people that play golf, wildly different audiences, right? There's I think the last time I saw the data in like 2019 at the tour, there was something like 50 million people in the US, or no, sorry, 15 million people in the US that played multiple rounds of golf per year and watched zero rounds of professional golf, not even the Masters.
Really?
And so like, yeah. So it's a bit different, I guess, for golf. But in terms of the strategies, we really leaned into athletes. The tour also started pursuing deals with streaming with Twitter and Facebook really early on. So as far back as 2016, the tour was streaming a portion of its Thursday and Friday rounds live for free on Twitter, to get that in front of a new audience. And I think what you're about to see with the Netflix thing that comes out in like
Let's get into
three
that. Yeah, go
weeks,
ahead.
yeah, uh, I think that's going to be such a game changer for the golf, because golf's already had, if you look at the industry data, 2020 and 2021 and 2022 data will come out soon, but those were the two biggest growth years ever in the industry, even bigger than when Tiger was at his heyday in terms of people starting golf, like playing golf. So something like 3 million people in 2021 played golf for the first time ever.
Wow.
And in 2021, it was the only high school sport to experience double digit percentage growth. So like there's a lot of indicators that like it's just becoming more popular as people realize that it's actually cheaper than they think. There's Top Golf's been a huge part of it, candidly, as well. And I think Netflix is going to like add a crazy amount of fuel to that fire because it's going to get released on February 15th. In most of the US, it's in most of the world, they're going to go be able to play it immediately once they see it. And I think people are going to see like, okay, this is kind of cool. I'm going to go try this. And then if either of you
Yeah.
have ever played golf, all you have to do is play once and hit one good shot, and you literally get it's a dopamine release in your brain. It feels good. And generally, like 1 out of every 3 people that plays golf sticks to golf. So it's like you just got to get them to try it, and like they'll be around.
So for those of you that don't know, similar to what what F1 did with
F1.
Drive to Success, right? PGA on February 15th
Yep.
is launching Full Swing on Netflix. And that's going to give
Yep.
viewers kind of this behind the scene access. But again, this drives back to what we're talking about. It's going to be player focused, where you got Jordan Spieth, Justin Thomas, Koepka, Scotty Scheffler, Rory, DJ, like a lot of the big
Yeah, it's
guys.
wild. And especially with what's going on in the golf world right now too,
Oh my
I'm
gosh.
fascinated to see what they got on camera this year because I was at the tour when this deal was inked with Netflix. I didn't have anything to do with it, but I was aware of it, and it was a big deal because the tour had to basically give up editorial control because Netflix would not agree to the deal if the tour had any editorial oversight, right? So the tour, for
Really?
the first time in its history, it's literally they've never done it before, and even Augusta did. Like they got the majors on board, so like there's footage from all of this stuff last year, and the tour had to really consciously give up that, knowing that the benefit was worth the risk, right? They know the audience size on Netflix and the demographics on Netflix as something they would never, ever, ever be able to replicate in their current model. So they were willing to give up control, knowing that their players and their brand could end up being painted in any number of ways,
Yeah.
because the audience opportunity is there.
Well, okay, I want to dig into some of the numbers here. So, like when we think about F1 and Drive to Success, like right now with F1, if you generally know that it's been bigger and more popular, their races are drawing over 2 million viewers on TV, and tickets are selling for $600 each. I mean, it's past
Yeah,
NASCAR and IndyCar in terms of viewership within a matter of like in a few years, which is just
yeah,
bonkers. And so I'm
yeah, it's
fascinated to
wild.
see what's going to happen here with PGA. But something that you hit on that I want to go deeper on is brands giving up editorial control because they
Hmm.
know that this heavily curated image that they've worked so hard to build over the years might not be the most effective to viewers today. So
Yep,
maybe let's
yep,
talk a little bit about that and how you feel about
yeah, yeah.
and advice that you might
I,
give to brands that have maintained editorial control.
yeah, yeah, I think it obviously depends on what you're trying to accomplish, but the tour is a great example, right? I mean, it's a you think of the PGA Tour, you have a perception of the brand, right? It's a pristine, clean, integrity filled brand, and they've worked long and hard to do that. And the biggest one that I'm interested to see is the tour has always been known as a conflict-free brand amongst its athletes, right? So if you think about all the other sports that exist in the world, there's known conflict amongst the teams, athletes, etc. The tour, golf's a gentleman's game. That goes back to the core of
Yep.
the sport. It's really not like that right now in the world. Like we were just talking about the European Tour stuff or the DP World Tour stuff that's going on this week, right? And so I'm fascinated to see because, but what we would all I would always tell this to my boss of the tour and several of us like our departments of the tour is that's what creates fandom because that's real life. Like like everyone like in your world, in my world, I get into arguments with people. People piss me off. Like I have that full range of emotions I get, and so do they. So do the tour
Mhm.
players, right? And so, and we've never, not we, they've never really shown that side of the athletes, right? Unless the athletes showed it themselves off the course or like chose to do so.
Yep.
But like anyone that follows the tour or that worked on the tour or has been around it knows that there's a lot of drama. And the one thing I think will also be a part of the series is I think a lot of people that don't play golf think it's not an athletic sport and don't see PGA Tour players as like comparable to like Steph Curry or whatever. But when they see the amount of time these guys spend in the gym and on recovery and on food prep and all that type of stuff, I think that's going to really turn the perception of a golfer around. Because in the series, you have Brooks, DJ, and Bryson will be in it a little bit. those are fit dudes. I mean, and
Oh
they
yeah.
work hard at that, right? But if you were to ask even a casual golf fan or someone who doesn't know golf very well, about, golf as athletes, they generally would be like, that's not the same, right? And it's not a
Yeah.
contact sport, but man, they work hard. And I think that's going to honestly have a huge impact on interest in the sport because people are like, oh, these are legit. And I think that's part of what happened with F1 too, right? Because part of the F1 series was about all the science that went into the game or went into the sport. And that's what captured me around F1 because like NASCAR never really got it, right? It's like turning left. I didn't, but
Sure.
the
Sure.
F1 stuff with all the science, like how they build the cars and like that's the interesting part to me. And I think golf's going to get some of that same drafting effect.
The thing with that too is like I all that there is science behind, even though they're just
Yeah.
turning left in NASCAR, there's
Yeah.
massive science to it because otherwise they
Yeah.
wouldn't have it. They just haven't shown it. And
Yep.
that's where I think a lot of brands right now can start to differentiate with this stuff. And I think
Yeah.
something
I
else
mean,
that you
part of
hit
the reason
on. Go
F1, I
ahead.
was
Go
going to
ahead.
say one more thing. Sorry.
Yeah.
Part of the reason F1 has been popular too is the drama between the athletes, right? I forget what
No
there
doubt.
was. I mean, Lewis Hamilton like punched a guy this year, didn't he? Or there was I mean, there was, I know that sounds, it's not all bad PR is good PR, but like, again, like that's part of the reason why like people are people. And so I'm so excited for the golf world to get exposed to that because that exists. Like I've seen players get into it before, but the tour doesn't broadcast that. And that's rightfully so. It's been their decision. It's been super successful for them. And I have
Yeah.
like, but I think it's going to be super cool for general sports fans to realize that these golfers are just like every other athlete. They're wildly competitive. They talk shit. I mean, there's all of that happens in golf.
Well, that's where so there's a key concept when we talk about fandom and the science behind fandom, right? A lot of it there's one of many principles that drives that is relatability. And so by
Yeah.
highlighting and empowering whether it be your administrators or your athletes, your employees, whatever it might be, when you empower them to showcase who they are, their
Yeah.
personalities, like you can start to create more relatability. And again, just like in real life, one golfer is not going to attract every single person, but you're going to
Totally.
allow
Yeah.
if you encourage everybody to do it, you're going to create a bunch of different niches that those niches can tie in and relate to
Yeah.
certain different people. And
I think
that's
there's
where,
also going to be some villains created too. I think there's going to be
which
some, so like
which is
like
great.
we would talk about that all the time at the tour when Brooks was kind of on his rise in 2019 and 2020 and winning all those majors. He had this bravado that no one had ever seen in golf, right? Like he's just I'm really confident and I'm not afraid to say it. And it was turning off a lot of fans. And there was actually like internal conversations around trying to like work with Brooks on that. And it's like a lot of us were saying, no, like we need a black hat. Like I was in a weird way always kind of happy that Patrick Reed was the way that he was because like they need that. Sports
Of
need
course.
like a-hole, like I mean every like it's why you need Dennis Rodman, you need Isaiah Thomas's, you need people, you need now like Pat Beverleys of the world in the NBA, like you
Yeah.
need people that are just needlers, and I think it's part of it's entertainment, so I think
I think back to like UNC basketball days. Like, could you imagine if
yeah.
Tyler Hansbrough would have had like an active social presence? Like, it would have
Yeah.
done wonders for the UNC brand because he
Yes.
could have showcased different personalities of him. But then everybody would have just haters and fans alike would have
Yeah.
gravitated towards him, and you would have got so
Yeah, or
much
like
engagement with the brand.
so true. Him and JJ Redick. You imagine like Redick in college on social
Oh
media
my
or something
God, it
like
would have been great.
yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, we're coming to the last couple minutes here of the show. I want to talk about some specific like tools that you use to study trends, practices, because you talked about this. The space is constantly evolving. So, what are your favorite tools to study the latest trends and happenings in the space?
So I guess I would give like two answers to that. I mean, like I'm a big believer in data, like of like what projects you're working on. So like we use for social media specifically, we use like Sprout Social, and I'm a big believer in like the enhanced analytics. And like one of the strategies that we implement on social that I don't see a lot of people doing is we label things on the back end and then report against the labels. So like we always work with a brand when we first start to bucket their content into 4 to 8 pillars. And then every single post that goes out is tagged on the back end with one of those pillars so that at the end of the month we can report against the pillars and say, okay, this month we posted 24 times about this topic and it resulted in X. It's actually doing really well, or maybe not. So I'm a huge believer, and people I think sometimes under like utilize the data side of things that's available on social, and people tend to default to creating content that they like, and not necessarily looking at the data of like, okay, just because you like it doesn't mean that it's what your audience wants. And I think that that's a huge thing that we're always preaching. But in terms of just like discovering content, I would say this may not be the best of answers. I'm on social media a lot, and I just consume a lot of different things.
Yeah.
I don't have necessarily like a specific tool or anything but I always like I read 2 books a month, or I listen to them in audiobooks, and I consume. I curate my feeds on social media to be different. So like Twitter for me is a very learning resource. So
Mm.
is LinkedIn.
Hmm.
TikTok is for me to discover whatever's trending. Like I've curated my own For You page so that when I log on there, I can get a sense of like, okay, this is trending and that type of thing. But yeah, so I just like utilize the platforms. I think part of that is just how I grew up, because I was literally on Twitter in like 2008, on Instagram so long ago that I've just used that as like my
Yeah.
newspaper and my online news source. So it's my own curated inspiration feed, I guess.
You mentioned Justin Welsh earlier. Are there any
Yep.
other like newsletters or creators out there other than yourself? We're going to link to all your social handles in the
Mhm.
bio. But are there any other creators or newsletters or things that you feel like are doing a really good job that people can learn from?
There are. I honestly don't remember them off the top of my head, like the creator names. Like I was just there's a guy on LinkedIn I've been engaging with a lot recently named Jacob Shipley, who he was head of social at like Walmart for a while, and he's got
Okay.
some really good content. But what I try to do is follow like a ton of people that don't work in sports. So like my Twitter feed is
Yep.
highly sports, right? So it's like a lot of people that I grew up with, or now people that work in digital and social at teams. My LinkedIn is basically all non-sports, and that's super intentional because I can always learn from. I think sports leads in some things, but it very much trails behind in other things in terms of like technology usage. So I try to like stagger the feeds to make sure that I'm kind of encountering like a number of people on a daily basis.
Love it. All right. Last couple questions here. Are there any opinions that you hear in this space of digital marketing, personal branding that you just flat out disagree with, and why?
My when I was at the tour, my one of my first bosses there, her name was Sloan Kelly. She's now like heads up an agency, but she had a viral jar, and I'll never forget it. And she made people put $1 into the jar anytime in a meeting they used the word viral, because it was just such an overused term from executives of like, how do we get this to go viral? Get this to go viral, or like the concept of like, hey, I came up with this idea, and it's on you, social team, to make it viral, right? And I think so that whole premise of a leadership coming up with an idea and jamming a square peg into a round hole and expecting the results to be great it happens a lot less now because more and more there are digital people in leadership. But 15, 16, 17, 18, like it was always something. Like I'll never forget, we were in this meeting one time. Still one of my friends, I won't use his name, but we are trying to fulfill a sponsor request, and the sponsor had this idea they wanted to do that was just a horrible, horrible idea on social, and it would have gotten like one like, and the sponsor rep at the tour was like, it doesn't, it's like, we just have to post something. It doesn't even have to be good. And I'm like, that right there is like indicative of like the mindset that had to change, right? And so it's just funny, like that's why I always look back to that as people trying to jam like a press release out onto social without giving the social team any time or resources to adapt that to the platform, or things like
I love it. We could go forever, and that continues to happen on a regular daily
yeah,
basis. I'm sure at
yeah,
teams
yeah,
and organizations around the country.
yep, yep, for
Awesome,
sure.
Preston. All right, last couple minutes here. Where can people follow along your journey, engage with you, interact with you? I'm sure there are people listening that are saying, "Hey, I'd love to bring Preston into my organization." How can people do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. I mean, personally, I'm on Twitter just at P_McClellan. You can't, Instagram's easy. It's at Preston. I'm not actually, ironically, super active on there anymore. It's kind of just like, it's a public profile. You can get to know my personality on there, but LinkedIn's a big one. And then I would tell you to check out our company's website is golfspacecollective.com. There's a ton of, we write weekly blogs on there for social and marketing strategy. Can be applied well outside the golf industry. They're always specific to golf, but they're tactics that work across sports and other industries as well. So would love to connect. My email address is on the site and everything too. So if anyone wants to reach out and connect more or ask questions or whatever the case may be, I'm always open to that.
Amazing. Preston, it has been a pleasure chatting with you. Excited for our next offline conversation.
Absolutely.
But yeah, enjoy the rest of the day. To everybody listening, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Awesome. See ya.
Hey guys, before you head out, just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. That helps more of your peers find the show as they search for ways to get better in their own roles. But this podcast is just a small part of what we do at EngageMint. In our normal day in the office, we're crazy focused on helping athletic departments and sports and entertainment companies generate more revenue by becoming more customer-centric. To see how we might be able to help your organization, visit engagementpartners.com to learn more. Download a free guide, check out our blogs and case studies, or schedule a call with us if you want to see how we can help with your particular objectives. Our goal is to help you create deeper connections with fans and generate more revenue. So when you're with us, hopefully you find a nugget or two that helps your cause.